Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Karl Martin. I teach American literature, specifically related to this material. I teach a course called Diverse Voices in American Literature. We deal with African American literature quite a bit and other American literature.
I'm Lindsey Lupo. I am a political science professor here at Point Loma Nazarene University. I primarily study public policy and urban politics. More specifically, I study race and ethnicity and race riots. So I've looked at sort of a century of race riots in the United States, most recently landing on the Ferguson uprising of 2014. I study the riot commissions that actually follow the riot, which is usually when people are like, it's not nearly as interesting as studying perhaps some of the protests. But
Hi, I'm Jeffrey Carr. I am the Associate Vice President for Student Development. I'm also the university's first and only Chief Diversity Officer, and I actually have a great opportunity to not only work in administration, but I'm also an adjunct faculty here. I teach some courses in sociology and social work, and also in the School of Education. And I have a very close connection with the book this year. One book won San Diego, and I'm very happy that it was chosen for this year, and happy that Point Loma is partnering. We'll hear a little bit more about those connections, I think, a little bit later on. But this is a unique opportunity I'm happy to be a part of.
I'm Jamie Gates. I teach over in the Department of Sociology and Social Work, cultural anthropologist by training, study South Africa, apartheid, post-apartheid, race relations and economics. I also direct the Center for Justice and Reconciliation, co-sponsoring tonight, where we do work against racial and immigration injustice. We do work for worker rights and international fair trade and against human trafficking.
I'm Dr. Jimiliz Valiente-Neighbours. For short, Dr. V is good. I teach race and ethnicity, introduction to sociology, and other upper division courses in the sociology, social work, and family sciences department. And I'm happy to say that I was just invited to be the Asian Student Union advisor, and so I'm really pleased to serve in that way, to add that.
My name is Montague Williams, and I've been teaching here at Point Loma for a year, so it's an honor, actually, to be on a panel with these folks. Before that, I taught at Eastern Nazarene College in Boston, where I served as chair of religion and chaplain of the college. Here, I get to focus primarily on the classroom, and it's pretty exciting. My research brings together the world of theology, but also ethnography and critical race theory. And so my work looks specifically at the experiences of youth and young adults in multiracial contexts, and I do ethical analysis of that, specifically working with archival documents in King's writings, Martin Luther King's writings.
Dr. Carr, would you start us off? What stands out to you when you think about the long history of the Civil Rights Movement? Are there moments that stand out to you because of either student involvement, engagement in those moments, or because of the implications that those moments had for higher education?
Well, what stands out for me is there's a lot of work that needs to be done, a lot that we have aspired to, and we've been inspired by many great leaders to achieve the kinds of things that we know are right for us. But what stands out is that going back 50 years ago, there was a lot of injustice, a lot of discrimination, a lot of inequity that through our efforts have gone through several iterations, but we still have a lot of those same types of issues that plague us as a group. And it's interesting to have this conversation today and to be really reminded we have to go. I will just tell you that today I read an article in the LA Times. I lived in LA for a while, and I love the LA Times. It's very well written, and I think it's pretty balanced. And so I have a subscription that I've had for like 30 some odd years. And the front page of the LA Times today was an article about racial injustice at some schools in Orange County. And in that particular article, he talked about a school that was majority white and a school that was majority non-white, and specifically 99% Latinx, 99% Hispanic. And at a football game this past weekend, the clash that those two schools had based only on race. Had a political underpinning to it, of course. But I looked at that today and thought about our conversation tonight. So how far have we come that our students today, the students who are going to be here at Point Loma in another year, the kinds of things that they're facing that they haven't dealt with. And I wonder, what more should we be doing? So I think about it a lot. One of the things that I have shared with Robin and others that back when these laws were passed, if we think about them, the 1964 and 65 Voting Rights and the Civil Rights Act of 64, we were on the precipice of what we thought would be the solution to the almost immoral kinds of living standards that we had in the United States. And I had an opportunity, and I was explaining this to someone just a minute ago, to actually have had to go on voter registration with a fellow by the name of Julian Bond. Does anybody know who Julian Bond is? Okay, Lindsey, all your history people need to be raising their hands now. You don't know who Julian Bond is. You know who John Lewis is, correct? Okay, so we're looking at his graphic novel. John Lewis and Julian Bond were sweeping through the South as part of a voter registration without the passing of the Voting Rights Act. And they came to my town. And I actually had an opportunity to do voter registration with them. And we met at a church, got instructions, got forms to fill out, and we went and knocked on doors to get people to register to vote. Today is what? National voter registration. It's still a very, very important topic. That was over 50 years ago, if I'm doing my math correctly. It's still a very important topic and something that a lot of push. And so when you ask that question, I'm still in the middle of it. I'm still experiencing that. And I still have a lot of thoughts about it. And I do know there's a lot of action, a lot of activity that still needs to happen in the government.
And so when Julian Bond and John Lewis came, you were a student?
I was.
Okay. So
during that time, it's very, you have to understand that most people in communities of color were very, very poor, especially in Mississippi. And to do voter registration, adults, men and women, all had to work. They couldn't take off work to go knock on doors to get people to register and vote. And so they would mobilize all the children to do it. And so, give you a hint, I was a child at the time, all right? I wasn't an adult. I don't want you looking at me and saying,
we're doing that.
This guy's got to be about 80 years old. No, I was a child. I was double-digit child. But I was a group of people that were mobilized and went through the community to do that. So that's how that happened.
Dr. Lupo, are there other moments of student involvement in the civil rights movement? Any stand out in your study of politics?
So, when I teach protests and social movements, and we spend about 3 weeks sitting with the civil rights movement, which always feels like not nearly enough time. And we read a book. It's a really prominent study by a sociologist, Steph McAdam, that studies sort of the arc of the movement, right? So sort of the generation, and then the heyday, and then the eventual decline. And I find that students really enjoy reading about the heyday, which is 1955 to 1960. And one of the really interesting things that he finds is that the movement's generation, a lot of it comes from prior organization, sort of combined with some other aspects. But he really sort of promotes this idea that it's not just like all of a sudden people are, like, we're just frustrated and all of a sudden we're just, going to do something about this. Like, there were so many things that were sort of in place leading up to this. And maybe later I can talk about like Brown v. Round Board and sort of built the organization there. But in terms of the organization in 1955 and 1960, he points in particular to colleges, churches, and the NAACP, and the way in which these three entities brought organization and resources. They brought members, they brought leaders, they brought communication networks. And with colleges, it really was with these Black colleges, particularly in the South, and in the book, we read about Nashville, but of course, the first sit-in movement is really in Greensboro, and the way in which everything spread out from there. And so he does this really interesting study, actually, where he looks at the first sit-in in Greensboro and then tracks where sit-ins were happening from there, and literally calculates the miles that it traveled. So he watches it like ripples, and it goes. And another academic actually found that in large part it followed the basketball circuit. And so as schools were playing one another, these students were learning about sit-ins as a tactic. And during that period of time, it was like 75% of the activity that was done by youth was the sit-in tactic. And so it was the tactic that they adopted, and then they ended up sort of disseminating it and really running with it. By the time you get to like 1960, and you really have sort of the full-fledged heyday of the movement, that's when you see that the students who are now a bit older start to join the organizations and become staffers. They become like paid movement leaders. So they join SNCC, they join the SCLC, they join CORE, and they basically become like career movement activists. So I know that with students, I know Rachel, I think you were in that class. We have a lot of fun sort of talking about the power of youth and what you can do with that.
Spark, any thoughts from other panelists to respond, to build on that?
Sure. Is it okay if I jump a little forward?
Please.
I'm actually thinking of the activism towards getting ethnic studies started in colleges and universities, because after the increase of students of color attending colleges and universities, they would find that the classes are primarily based on Eurocentric, and just on for example, like theorists from Europe, or from quote unquote a long time ago. In fact, my own sociological theory professor called it the zombie white men, because they keep coming back in our curriculum, and so that's never left my mind. And so a lot of the activism, for example, in Berkeley, trying to get ethnic studies started is we are here, but we are not learning anything about ourselves, and we are not learning anything about the greater world. We are learning something very narrow. And so I'm thinking the activism around that, college students asking college is really important. This is where I find who I am. This is where my identity is really challenged and strengthened, and it's important to learn from other sources and learn it in a diverse context as well. So both white and non-white students could be learning from each other in ethnic studies courses.
So that moment where it's I'm here on this campus, but I'm not represented in the curriculum. And I do not see myself in the curriculum. And interesting, again, if you don't know the history of higher ed, this is really a student push to say we need to be represented in the curriculum. Yeah, follow up?
Well, that conversation has me thinking about some of the research I've done. So I recently accepted the role as advisor to Black Student Union, which I'm really excited about, and president of BSU's. We tend to think about this as a historical trace, but the reality is this sense of finding a college campus to be not for oneself is still a reality that takes place among students of color on college campuses. In some of the research I've done, you find young people that make their way through their high school lives thinking about race in a way that tries to hide it from their own experience, try to find a way to say it does not matter. And it's very consistent that it is in college. Part of this has to do with human development, but it also has to do with being in a classroom. Miguel A. de la Torre says, we call a classroom not only because people gather as a class, but it also becomes a space where people become very aware of how they are classed in society. And within the college context, young people begin to find that the questions they're asking, the stories they want to share, the attempts to try to just get along with somebody in terms of just a natural connection, it begins to get at the questions of race, and race then becomes way more important than one wanted to recognize or accept. And colleges become a space for making sense of that, which gives us a great deal of responsibility of what we do to make space for those questions, and how do we have those conversations in ways that just don't let it run in unhelpful directions, but run in directions that help change society in helpful ways.
Just a quick word on like this movements as a transition from one generation to the next. I think in March we learned a little bit from John Lewis about his tension with the older generation, and I think the college environment not only sets up this place for identity formation and search, but it also creates like this space to rethink the way things are, and the way things they should be. And you think in big ideas, and you got this space extracted from having to make a living immediately, and at least those that are working at college, they're making a living as they go. I don't mean to suggest that, but there's a space, at least mental space, to step back. And then you get Lewis looking at in fact the SNCC is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is created in part because the NAACP is too conservative. It's too status quo. The leadership has done a lot, and they recognize that, but they also recognize that maybe they benefit too much from what's going on. Maybe they're too tightly connected to the positions of power, and students aren't yet. Students don't have deep vested interests. They don't own homes. They don't have jobs that are dependent on somebody else having them climb a ladder somewhere, and they've got this freedom to rethink and then also call the system to change. And this happened in South Africa's anti-apartheid movement. I mean, Mandela, you think of Mandela as one of the old guys now, now he was one of the icons of the movement, but he was one of the youth that when the ANC, the African National Congress, was in its formational stages all the way into its hard confrontation with apartheid, would not take that next step to get aggressive against, wouldn't use violence, for example. Mandela was one of the first to help start Umkhonto we Sizwe, that the spear of the nation, the armed resistance to apartheid. And I get this sense that, it was Lewis's generation, that young preacher and the people who are sitting in the counters that started to do that en masse, who were ready to push the envelope much more than their predecessors were, even though they can't deny the work that the hard hoeing of hard ground that their predecessors have done.
That's a challenge for leaders, and especially I think in an academic context, to both provide that leadership but also provide the space to let students and a younger generation kind of step out in ways that maybe makes them uncomfortable as leaders, but maybe necessary for some kind of project.
I do want to push back on that just a little bit, because I think historically, Lindsey, you can help me out on this if you like, that we tend to want to polarize those different types of groups that were active during this period and say they were kind of clashing with one another. But I was there. It was really a real ownership that all voices needed to be heard. And they had different ways of how people wanted to get to the end goals. But there was a lot of close-knit cooperation between the SCLC, the NAACP, and SNCC that with everyone except for maybe the Black Panthers a little bit later, but there was a lot of cohesiveness that happened as well. There was a lot of the young people listening to the older generation. Yes, that is what's needed. You need the young people to come in and to kind of push things further in a different way to what is their reality. But there was a lot of cooperation. I was there when SNCC brought in James Brown to Tougaloo College, which was a small HBCU right there in Jackson, Mississippi, and how they invited the NAACP to co-host with them. It was interesting because the NAACP didn't think that James Brown was an appropriate figure to bring for this. But when James Brown came, it was literally thousands and thousands of people showed up. Okay, no one knows who Julian Brown is. Anybody know who James Brown is? Okay, good. All right. And so everyone kind of joined together, and they actually benefited from their cooperation. But it is a generational. So right now, there's a different generation needed to go beyond the generations that we have. And those things that are important to this generation should be things that are listened to and that they are honored and they are explored.
It's true. I mean, it's very common for people to think about what King did and what others did as in this constant fight with each other. But the reality is there were differences, but that differences created a sort of dialogue. And if you were to look into it, you'd find that at Martin Luther King's assassination, the person who came to the front to discuss how horrible this is was Stokely Carmichael, who many would consider a sort of opponent, at least strategically. But he went on and on to explain how the death of King is significant because King sought to dialogue with a broader group than Stokely Carmichael did, but Stokely Carmichael did appreciate that because it also made room for his strategy. That there was this sort of collaboration, even if people wanted to focus more on the differences.
So if we turn to higher education, the goals of colleges, once they get this pushback on curriculum, once they get the ground laid with integrating racial integration, then we start thinking about what strategies do we have to bring greater diversity to campus. And I think we have both diversity. Now we're talking about racial diversity. We're also talking about gender diversity. How do you diversify that campus? There are legislative angles, affirmative action being one. So how, Dr. Lupo, how does affirmative action kind of work its way into higher education practice? And what are some of the benefits, what are some of the drawbacks to that process?
Well, a number of, I would say, significant Supreme Court rulings on affirmative action. So 78 is maybe sort of the place to start, where we have the University of California versus Bakke case, where the Supreme Court rules that the University of California at Davis's medical school is violating the Constitution because they are using a quota system. So it seems like this is sort of this knock to affirmative action. But in the writing of the majority, they essentially say we are not opposed to affirmative action, and we believe that there is a place for race-conscious admissions to occur, and that it should come about if it's a compelling interest, like if the university can show a compelling interest or if the government can show a compelling interest. And so even though that is sort of a knock in terms of the quota system, moving forward, that sort of upholds affirmative action. That kind of takes us to 2003 in the Grutter versus Bollinger case, where the University of Michigan, their law school, it is upheld that it is constitutional to have a race-conscious process in terms of admissions. And the way that the Supreme Court has typically seen it is that as long as race is just one factor in the admissions process, then it can be used. So it's not constitutional to say you get 20 points if you are a person of color, but it is constitutional to say we are going to look at the whole person, and we are going to say, what has your life been like? We're going to look at your income, we're going to look at your gender, we're going to look at any obstacles that you've had in your life, we're also going to look at your race. And we're going to combine that with the fact that as a university, we're committed to diversity, and we understand that there is a educational and societal benefit to having a diverse population. And so that 2003 case essentially upheld affirmative action. It was really challenged in 2013 with the University of Texas case, Fisher versus University of Texas, where a lot of affirmative action activists thought that that was going to be sort of the nail in the coffin, and that was going to do it in. When this young white woman had sued the University of Texas, saying that she was denied admission because of her race, because she was white. And instead they ended up upholding it because was kind of some legal maneuvering as to how they upheld it. But if you ever want to read some really interesting work, read the majority opinion in that 2013 case, in the Fisher case, where Justice Scalia oddly sides with the majority, but says that he believes that race should never be a factor in the admissions process. He doesn't, and Justice Thomas also jumps in and says that he does not believe that there is really any benefit to having, to sort of forcing that diversity on the campus. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, interestingly, did not side with the majority, and it was because she felt it didn't sort of go far enough, where she said, you all are sort of pretending, like we're like playing this game of like it's one factor in many, and then you have to sort of like stick to this strict standard. And she was like, just call a spade. Like, we have messed up as a country in terms of historical discrimination. We are trying to repair that. Let's move forward and just say that that's what we're doing. Like, let's stop all this sort of jargon. And so her dissent in that case, and she was the lone dissenter in that 2013 case, is a really, really interesting read to see her like really aggressive sort of push for diversity. So I'll stop. I can talk too about sort of how I view diversity and how I think it brings such a richness to my classroom. But I know that all my colleagues can do that too.
Yeah, what would be the compelling argument? What would be the compelling interest of a university of having a racially diverse student body?
Can I just quickly ask, how many, raise your hand if you're here for extra credit. If you're here for extra credit. Okay. Raise your hand if you're just here. Raise your hand if you're here just because you're very interested in the conversation. Oh, okay. It's just
if
helpful
you're not
to,
interested in the conversation.
Yeah.
And you can't be here for extra credit.
No, I know.
Interested.
There's both. There's both. It's just helpful to know how deep we could go into this. It's just helpful to know. You know what I mean?
Okay.
I think what you're speaking into is the reality and the debate around post-racialism. So there was the whole post-racial America claim when Barack Obama was elected. Obviously, I mean, if someone were to say we live in a post-racial America, I don't know where you are. But even as that has gone away, what's remained is post-racialism, which is the practices and strategies and declarations around the idea that race should not matter and that we should operate as if race does not matter. And so that's still an operative mode that takes place in the United States, and it plays a role in this question. I mean, the fact that you can even ask that question is a result of the pervasiveness of post-racialism.
Well, before we get into that, there's an interesting part of this that I really want to put on the table. And that is the fact that the term or phrase affirmative action has been demonized for many, many decades.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And it's a polarizing term that, getting to all the cases, that seems to never be dealt with. And because it is such a polarizing term or phrase, that people aren't open to considering the outcomes of making sure that all of our institutions are fair and equitable in terms of who is a part of it, because it was correcting centuries-long segregation that prevented certain groups of people from attaining a higher education degree. And of course, after the Civil War, with the advent of HBCUs, in only certain venues that could happen. But affirmative action is something that has not ever, I think everything you could do from the Pew Research and other types of data that's available has never been attained. Affirmative action hasn't really ever worked because there's been a great deal of resistance to it. And for that reason, a lot of people think it should not be in place because it hasn't worked. Now, the reason that it hasn't worked has nothing to do with if it was a good policy or a good idea at the time. During Johnson's tenure, when he was looking at this as the president, he was really looking at the fact that there was this wide sense of disparity between groups of people, not just Black or Hispanic, but really he was more interested in poverty and the people who were really entrenched in poverty. And so when you think about that, who has gained the most from affirmative action? Does anyone know? Don't deny it. Who's gained the most from affirmative action since that? Go ahead and raise your hand, Linda. White women. White women. And right now there's a huge host of people who would be against it, and there are white women. And it's unusual because it was meant to jumpstart our efforts to undo really centuries of oppression of groups of people. So with that having been said, you look at someone like Clarence Thomas. Why is he against the film? He said it when he was actually being interviewed, or what's the thing he's doing, Kevin? This confirmation hearing, not an interview. During this hearing, he was against affirmative action, which just rung a lot of bells for a lot of people. Here we have a Black man who's against it because it's been demonized from the beginning that no Black person wants to be told that you're only out of college because you're Black, not because you are eligible, not because you have met the criteria to be there. The only reason you're there is Black. And that continues on, not just with affirmative action, but everything else. It's a character like, you're here because you play sports. You're here for any number of reasons. And so those are some of the issues that are just kind of embedded in that we have to work our way through, because there are folks who still say that and think that. I will tell you that on yesterday, I did a seminar for our new faculty here. And my topic for the new faculty was microaggressions. And that is a definite microaggression. It's actually a microassault. And so it says you're only here because of affirmative action. And I showed them posts from current students. This is students at Point Loma Nazarene University, of things that have been said that were memorialized at the Stations of the Cross. You know, during Easter, this past April, we have the Stations of the Cross all across campus. And on that particular, I went out and I saw it and was like, oh my goodness. I went and took pictures of it, not knowing how it needed later on. But I showed it to the new faculty and they were aghast. So yes, there are some issues in terms of who is on a campus, how welcome they feel on those campuses, what the benefit is, which your question was, what is the benefit of that? The benefit is we become truly educated, not partially educated. We become fully educated, not just about us and our own reality, but the realities of everyone. And those are the kinds of things that I think was meant to happen with all of those kinds of programs that happen, because we had a long way to go. It's probably only one person in this room, and I'm not going to put that person out, who actually lived through that period. It was unlike anything that you can probably imagine. You can't imagine what it was like. I remember in January, we went on civil rights pilgrimage about 3 or 4 years ago, and the first one we went on, which was in whatever year that was, 2014. And we went to the museum for Rosa Parks Museum. And they showed all the bombed out buses and all this information about when they did the bus boycott. And that happened in 1955, 1956. And as a result of it, the boycott worked. They had to integrate the buses. What people don't realize is that it doesn't happen overnight. I lived in Jackson, Mississippi, which is about probably a 2 or 3 hour drive from Montgomery. And I grew up taking public buses, and this was decades later, that were segregated. And as a Black person, I had to go to the back of the bus. This is over 10 years after the Rosa Parks boycott, or the boycott that happened in Montgomery. Yet and still, there are things that are happening that we have not dealt with in regard to that. And those are some of the things that, on our college campuses, people come with all of this baggage of lifestyles and treatment and transgressions that they bring to the camp. And we need to hear those so that we can adjust and we can make a better, have a better understanding. So what is, we talk about cultural competency all the time. Cultural competency is knowing more about others and then being able to make better decisions as a result of knowing that. In higher education, you can't know more unless you are exposed to it, and then now we can make better decisions. That's where the competence comes in, making better decisions as a result of that. I'm going to shut up.
Can we keep it local and talk about what Point Loma can do, needs to do, could do?
Well, if we think about what Christian colleges in particular coming to this question in their own populations, more generally, the Christian colleges and universities around the country, a couple hundred of them, what started in the law for affirmative action back in the late 70s started to get implemented, and the ethnic studies programs you're talking about started to grow from early 80s, really, in functional department strength and growth. All of that conversation doesn't really hit the Christian colleges until really late 90s, early 2000s even, where race consciousness, where ethnic diversity becomes a structural issue for college boards, for administrations, for hiring practices. And so, I come in 2001 to Point Loma, and we have about 10% students of color in 2001. So that's at a time when, that's 10% at Point Loma, but most Christian colleges were in those kind of ratios, except for a few that were in like New York City and a couple other places. But it took, in Point Loma's case, a race conscious, race and ethnic conscious plan, never called affirmative action, but a way of weaving race consciousness into what we call mission fit. So there's a funnel, there's this metaphor of a funnel and who fits. There's lots of people. If you're Christian, if you're, we have had an affirmative action program for a very long time for guys, right? You have a little bit more chance of getting into Point Loma with lower scores, with same scores, with all things being equal if you're a guy, and if particularly we have an affirmative action program for Nazarene of whatever background, right? Because there's a decision made by the university of this background and heritage that we need to have a campus that reflects this wider range of people, but we need to have we especially need to make sure that Nazarenes can go to a school like this. And most Nazarene schools have that kind of affirmative action program. So to make it less of a harsh term, it's been applied beyond race, but in practice, but we don't call it that. And so preferential treatment for, or in a positive sense, a discriminatory decision, right, for the good, for the sake of the whole, for the sake of the education of the whole. Point Loma moves from 10% in 2001 to 40-ish% right now of students of color at Point Loma, but through in the earlier slow decisions, in the last 10 years, much more aggressive decisions. On the hiring side, we've not made nearly that level of progress as we have on the student side of things. But that pattern replicates itself, and Point Loma, in some ways, in that 15-year period, has made more progress than most of its peers by its intentionality. If you look at the trends of racial diversification of student bodies across the CCCU, there are a small number of schools that have made that level of progress. And it's not, you make the call on whether it's enough progress or whether it's fast progress or slow progress, but we're no matter how you measure it, we're in sort of the leading edge of that level of diversification, that percentage of diversification. Not that we're the most diverse school in the CCCU. How would you all perceive that? Just think from the data perspective, is that level of diversification going on? Now, I'll throw out, maybe we should also talk about campus climate, and from a sociological perspective, what you can literally feel the numbers, or you can test the numbers that it takes to create a critical mass on a campus, so that there is support services, so that there's a sense of affinity, a sense of connectedness by students of a particular subgroup. Do we have a critical mass of certain subpopulations? That really matters. When you're in a large school, that's a little easier to create because the overall population is larger. When you're in small schools like ours, and you don't have a critical mass of a particular subpopulation with which somebody needs to identify, wants to identify, which we all want to have that particular voice, it's hard to sustain. People don't stay, don't feel welcome if there's not a critical mass of students of color in general, but then even of particular subpopulations that people want to and need to identify with.
I know that teaching here through that time period, there's this sense at some point that we are asking a whole lot of these students to come that are coming to our campus. And until you get to that critical mass, you feel like the burden kind of starts to lift from the shoulders of individual students as we start to feel a greater sense of it. We want to leave some time for questions.